He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, "Do more." And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
When June Lockhart died on October 23, 2025, at the age of 100, in her home in Santa Monica surrounded by her daughter and granddaughter, something quietly ended that had been running since 1965. She was the last adult member of the Robinson family from the original CBS series Lost in Space still alive, and her death closed a 60-year chapter that almost nobody watching the show as children ever fully understood while it was happening. Most fans remember the foam rubber aliens, the robots' warnings, and Dr. Smith's theatrical cowardice. Almost nobody knows the stranger, sadder, and occasionally funnier story sitting underneath all of it. The story of who these people actually were, what the show cost them, and what they quietly carried for the rest of their lives. Lost in Space premiered on CBS in September 1965 and ran for 3 seasons and 83 episodes, telling the story of the Robinson family, astronaut pioneers launched toward Alpha Centauri who get knocked off course and stranded on hostile worlds. It was, on paper, a science fiction adventure for children. In practice, it became something closer to a small, strange family that worked together for 3 years, then spent the next 60 years figuring out what that experience had actually meant to each of them. Here is what most fans never figured out. By the time June Lockhart put on the role of Dr. Maureen Robinson, the brilliant biochemist mother of the family, she had already lived an entire career most actors would consider a lifetime achievement. Born in New York City in 1925 to Jean and Kathleen Lockhart, both working actors, she made her screen debut as a child alongside her own parents in the 1938 film adaptation of A Christmas Carol, playing their daughter on screen the same way she was their daughter in life. She went on to appear in Meet Me in St. Louis, won a Tony Award for her Broadway debut in the 1940s, and spent 6 years as the warm, steady mother on Lassie before Lost in Space ever existed. What fans rarely registered is that by 1965, Lockhart was not a young actress hoping a science fiction show might make her career. She was already an established star taking on a role in a show nobody could be sure would last a single season. And it became, alongside Lassie, the role she would be most identified with for the rest of her life. More than 80 years of screen work distilled, in the public mind, down to 2 television mothers. Lockhart never stopped being involved with the world the show represented, either. She became a genuine, lifelong advocate for NASA and the space program, attending launches, interviewing astronauts, and in 2013 receiving NASA's Exceptional Public Achievement Medal for her decades of public support for space exploration. The actress who played a fictional space pioneer spent the rest of her real life cheering on actual ones. That connection came full circle in the most fitting way imaginable. When Netflix rebooted Lost in Space for a new generation between 2018 and 2021, Lockhart returned, at well past 90 years old, to voice Alpha Control in the show's final season. It was her last on-screen role. She had begun her association with the Robinson family in 1965 and closed it out more than 55 years later, then lived another several years after that, passing away peacefully at 100 years old in October 2025, having outlived every other adult member of the original Robinson family. If there is one character from Lost in Space that defined the show in the public imagination, it is Dr. Zachary Smith, the cowardly, scheming, endlessly self-important stowaway played by Jonathan Harris. What almost no fan realizes is how far Harris traveled, literally and figuratively, to become the man capable of playing that role. Jonathan Harris was born Jonathan Daniel Charasuchin in 1914, the second of 3 children in a poor family living in the Bronx. His parents, Sam and Jenny, were Russian Jewish immigrants. His father worked in Manhattan's garment district, and the family's apartment was crowded enough that young Jonathan sometimes had to give up his bed to board as his mother took in to help make ends meet. From the age of 12, he worked as a clerk in a pharmacy. But his father also took him to the Yiddish theater and encouraged him to listen to opera, and somewhere in that contrast between a hard, working-class childhood and an exposure to performance and culture, something in young Jonathan decided he was going to become someone else. At 17, without telling his parents, he legally changed his name from Charasuchin to Harris. He deliberately worked to drop his Bronx accent and replace it with a more refined, almost theatrical voice that would later become instantly recognizable as Dr. Smith's. In 1936, he earned a degree in pharmacology from Fordham University, and then, instead of using it, walked toward the theater instead, joining a playhouse on Long Island at 24. By the time Irwin Allen was casting Lost in Space, Harris had built a substantial career as a character actor, including a beloved recurring role as the fussy assistant Bradford Webster on the television version of The Third Man, a part he reportedly considered his favorite of his career. He had also reportedly beaten out other respected actors for the role of Dr. Smith. Here is the detail almost nobody knows. Dr. Smith did not exist in the original unaired pilot for Lost in Space. The character was added afterward, at the network's request, because executives wanted a recurring antagonist who could create conflict episode after episode without requiring a brand new threat every week. Harris was brought in to fill that gap, and what he built from it became one of the most enduring comic characters of 1960s television. By his own account and that of people around the production, Harris leaned hard into making Smith funny rather than simply villainous, and audiences responded so strongly that the character's blend of cowardice, vanity, and grandiose self-pity became the engine of the show. Harris received roughly 500 fan letters a month during the years Lost in Space aired, and according to those who knew him, he made a point of answering every single one. The man who had once worked as a 12-year-old pharmacy clerk in a crowded Bronx apartment building had become, by his 50s, one of the most recognizable comic villains on American television, and he never stopped being grateful for it. That gratitude had limits, though, and they were entirely about respect. Decades after Lost in Space ended, when a feature film adaptation was being produced in the late 1990s, the studio offered Harris, by then in his 80s, a small cameo of only a handful of lines. According to widely reported accounts, Harris was blunt about his reaction, stating flatly that he had never played a walk-on or bit part in his career and had no intention of starting. He turned the offer down. A planned reunion film, tentatively titled Lost in Space, The Journey Home, was in development in the early 2000s with Harris set to return to the role that had defined his later career. In November 2002, Harris entered the hospital for treatment of a chronic back problem, the same back that Dr. Smith had spent 3 seasons theatrically complaining about, and died of a blood clot just 3 days before what would have been his 88th birthday. The reunion project did not move forward without him. His legacy did not end there, though. Late in his career, Harris became a prolific voice actor, lending his voice to Manny the Praying Mantis in Pixar's A Bug's Life in 1998 and to a character in Toy Story 2 the following year. Work that introduced an entirely new generation of children to his voice, even if most of them had no idea who Dr. Smith was. He was married to his childhood sweetheart, Gertrude Bregman, from 1938 until his death in 2002, a 64-year marriage that long outlasted any television role. Of everyone associated with Lost in Space, perhaps no one's story is less known than the man who physically brought the robot to life for all 83 episodes. His name was Bob May, and the way he got the job says everything about how television actually worked in 1965. May was not auditioning for Lost in Space at all. He was a working stuntman applying to be a stunt double for actor Red Buttons on an entirely different production when Irwin Allen's team approached him about an open role, playing the robot. According to the story that has been repeated by those who knew him, including June Lockhart herself, Allen's standard for the job was almost comically simple. If you could physically fit inside the suit, you had the part. May fit. When he climbed out of the costume after that first try-on, he was cut and bleeding from the suit's metal edges, and he took the job anyway. May came from a genuine show business lineage. His grandfather was Sheik Johnson, half of the famous vaudeville comedy duo Olsen and Johnson, and May had been performing since he was 2 years old, appearing in his grandfather's stage reviews. By the time Lost in Space came along, he had already worked for years as an actor and stuntman, including appearances alongside Jerry Lewis. For 3 seasons, May wore a costume built of metal and fiberglass weighing roughly 200 pounds, with limited visibility and mobility. He learned every other actor's lines in every episode, because inside the suit he couldn't see or hear cues the normal way. The only way he knew when to move or react was by memorizing the entire script himself. He later described the suit, with apparent affection, as his home away from home, and would often stay inside it even during breaks between takes because getting in and out was so difficult. The robot's most famous catchphrases and warnings, including Danger, Will Robinson, were voiced by the show's announcer, Dick Tufeld, who also narrated the series. But May's own voice can occasionally be heard in the character, particularly when the robot is singing or when its voice overlaps with other characters' dialogue. The performance fans fell in love with was a genuine collaboration between 2 men, one of whom was almost never acknowledged by name. After Lost in Space ended in 1968, May continued working in Hollywood for decades as a stuntman, extra, and crew member on productions including The Time Tunnel. He stayed close to the world of science fiction fandom for the rest of his life, becoming a beloved fixture at conventions, where he would meet fans who had grown up watching a character whose face they never saw and whose name, For years, most of them never knew. Bob May died on January 18, 2009, at 69 years old, in Lancaster, California. He was survived by his wife, Judith, 2 children, and 4 grandchildren. For 3 years, he had been the physical heart of one of the most beloved characters in 1960s television, and most of the people who grew up loving the robot never learned his name until long after the show had ended. Lost in Space never got the ending its characters were promised. The Robinson family was never rescued on screen. They never reached Alpha Centauri. The series simply stopped after 3 seasons, with the family still stranded, a fictional family whose story was left permanently incomplete, the same way so many of the real stories behind the show stayed unfinished or unknown for decades afterward. What actually connects June Lockhart, Jonathan Harris, and Bob May isn't science fiction at all. It's the fact that each of them brought an entire lifetime of experience, a childhood acting alongside her own parents, a journey from a crowded Bronx tenement to one of television's most beloved comic performances, a stuntman who bled to fit into a costume and then spent 3 years memorizing everyone else's lines just to do his job, into roles that millions of children watched without ever knowing any of it. June Lockhart outlived all of them, carrying the story of that show from its black and white premiere in 1965 all the way to a Netflix reboot more than 50 years later, and finally to her own peaceful death at 100 years old in October 2025. With her passing, the living link between the audiences of 1965 and the people who actually built the Jupiter 2, wore the robot suit, and reinvented Dr. Smith from scratch finally came to a close. The Robinson family never made it home in the story, but the people who played them lived full, complicated, often quietly extraordinary lives, most of which the fans who loved them never got the chance to fully know until now.